Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the two big-name prospects that have been playing in the NHL for the San Jose Sharks thus far this season, Will Smith and Macklin Celebrini. I had my prospect update video coming out in just a few days, and I was going to include both of these players in that, but then after giving it a little bit more thought, my prospect update videos are usually for the guys who don't really have as much of an opportunity to have the spotlight on them. There's not as many eyeballs on them because they play in leagues that are a little bit more difficult to actually catch the games of. The NCAA, the SHL, the CHL, while comparing that to the NHL, well, that is a more publicized league. People will watch those games because they're just easier to get access to. Me personally, I have seen every single one of the games that both of these players have played, every single one of the shifts that both of these players have played, and so there's much more room for an in-depth analysis of how they have performed compared to the other players. So I didn't really want to kind of have that overshadow them, and as such, separated them into these two videos. And so for this one, we will focus on just these two players. And we start off with Will Smith, the 4th overall draft pick from 2023. The three players above him made the transition to the NHL right away. Smith instead went to college playing in the NCAA, and he led that league in terms of points, 71 points, actually the first NCAA player to hit that 70-point mark in almost 10 years. And so the question this past offseason was, would he go back? His two boys, Ryan Leonard and Gabe Perreault, his very classic line mates of the past two seasons, both recommitted to college, but perhaps because Celebrini was making that transition to the NHL, Will Smith decided to follow suit. And there was definitely talk that maybe he wasn't fully prepared to actually do that. Even Mike Greer, when he signed that contract, had mentioned that there was a possibility he would float between the NHL and the AHL. But when it came to the beginning of the season and it came to the preseason, after playing those 3 preseason games he did and really not having much of an impact, it became quite clear that the Sharks were going to take a patient approach with him, because any other young player who put up a performance like that would have been sent down with 0 questions, and yet Smith would end up cracking the lineup. And it really wouldn't improve for those first few games. The first month of the season, Smith was continued to just make very little impact on the game. I don't think he had a singular point for the first few games of his entire career. And as such, there were many calls to send him down to the AHL, including from myself. It seemed as though it would be better for him to get 18 minutes of ice time playing with Colin Graf and Podorowski than playing in the NHL 11 minutes of ice time with Luke Cunnin and Barclay Goodrow. But again, the Sharks showcasing incredible patience with him. Even though many people will talk about how the NHL isn't a development league, the Sharks were using it as such for Will Smith to be able to have that success, perhaps again to try and keep his development in line with a player like Macklin Celebrini, as these two players seem to be pretty close off the ice. But credit to Will Smith and credit to the Sharks, he would end up improving extremely so as more time would pass. The Will Smith of the last month and a half is extremely different from the Will Smith from the first month of the season. Now, what is he doing correctly? Well, the really big talent that stands out above the rest, and this was kind of coming as advertised, is definitely his playmaking ability and his vision on the ice. He is a great passer. We take a look at, Mario Ferraro, Jack Thompson, and Tyler Toffoli. All three of these players have Will Smith to thank for an easy tap-in goal this season because of Smith's ability to freeze defenders. I mean, anyone who can get Mario Ferraro a goal is probably doing something right in the NHL, but we also see Smith constantly go for a very similar type of move of entering the zone, absorbing some pressure, and then finding that cross-ice pass, and it actually works with a decent amount of frequency, at least as of late. And so that creates a lot of very good openings for his teammates. On top of that, the transition from moving to center to wing, which he has done after the first around month of the season as well, has also benefited him in that regard because he doesn't have as much of a kind of defensive responsibility. He doesn't have to be as responsible. He doesn't have to hang back as much. He can cheat a little bit more for offense, which has opened the game up a little bit more. Obviously, the Sharks will ultimately want him to eventually go back to being a center, I imagine, but currently it does seem as though, especially with the makeup of the Sharks team, that the wing is best off for him, and it has really opened up his ability to be a strong playmaker. But it is not only that really shines. He's also got a pretty good shot. 6 goals on the season would put him on around a 18 or so goal pace over a full 82 game year, which for a 19-year-old is certainly not too bad. I can definitely see that trending upwards, not only through the rest of this season. I wouldn't be surprised if he could hit the 20 goal mark this year, potentially, but also as we move forward in his career. The two things that are going to be were holding him back slightly this season something that should improve as we move forward is, one, his strength on his stick. There are times in which he's not really getting as much on his shot as he would like, fanning on them a couple of times as well, because he's got good strength on it and he's also got good accuracy. It's just about being able to get it off, but also trying to get shots from in closer, from in tighter. When you're below the face-off dot, that makes it an extremely dangerous area to score, and a lot of the time Smith is taking those shots from above the face-off dot, where suddenly most NHL goaltenders would be able to make the save unless you have like a really sort of picture perfect type of opportunity for himself. But the shot is still pretty good. When it comes to his skating, this was definitely a major issue for him coming into the NHL. It felt as though the game was essentially just passing him by. He wasn't moving his feet. He wasn't playing with much pace, and that was a major issue, as I said. However, he has improved in that area as well. He's not necessarily the type of player who's going to dazzle you with their speed, but it's not as though every single NHL player who comes in has to be a speedy guy like a Connor McDavid or even a Macklin Celebrini. Look at one of the best Sharks players of all time, Joe Thornton. He was never someone who was so impressive on his skates, but he would slow the game down and he'd be able to find these passes. This is why he is one of the best playmakers of all time, not just for the Sharks, but in the NHL as a whole. To maybe use a little bit more of a modern example, look at Nikita Kucherov, who just put up 140 plus points last year. He's also not someone who's going to dazzle you with his skating, but he's so incredibly talented that he's able to put up these points anyway. Will Smith, kind of in that same mold, not to say that he's going to reach the levels of a Kucherov or a Joe Thornton, but he's going to be trying to fit into that type of bucket when it comes to him. And indeed, he has still there's kind of like a basic level you do have to reach, and he has been moving his feet a lot more as of late in both the offense and the defensive zone, so that's been definitely nice to see. When it comes to his general game sense, his hockey IQ in the O-zone as well, early on this season he was definitely struggling with that, likely due to that lack of pace in his game where players were easily converging on him and preventing him from really having to make a good play. He would have to play under duress, under pressure a lot. These days, however, he's finding the open ice. He's being able to attack in areas where there is a lack of coverage, which has allowed him to find more passing lanes, more shooting opportunities, as well start to put up some of these points, right? 6 goals, 5 assists, 11 points in 28 games, puts him on pace for around 30 for a full season. It's certainly not bad for a 19-year-old in the NHL, and so that is something that has also been trending upwards as of late. When it comes to his defensive game, obviously there are the no surprise struggles for a young player. This is what's very important to mention, is that most teenagers, most young 20 rookies who are coming into the NHL, they're not going to have a lot of success here. Even the best of the best prospects. Look at Connor McDavid. In his second season in the NHL, he won the Art Ross, 100 points that particular year, and yet his first few years defensively in the NHL were not very good. Look at Connor Bedard, who was drafted the very same year as Will Smith. He still is not a very good defensive player. And so it's not a surprise that Will Smith would break in here and struggle through the first 28 games of his career to defend against seasoned veterans in the NHL. But having said that, as with many other cases, he has been trending upwards there too. Just his performance the other night, or the other day, I guess I should say yesterday, against the Edmonton Oilers, he found himself on the ice a couple of times against Leon Draisaitl or Connor McDavid, and I actually thought he did a pretty good job of holding his own. There are still more strides to make. There is still a bit of a ladder to climb here. His ability to actually find himself in good positions in the defensive zone to swap off coverage and just generally fit into the Sharks system that Warsofsky has them playing is pretty good, but now it's about making those strides. It's about attacking players who are within that area of coverage for you, separating players from puck. That's really what those next steps are going to be. But for now, Smith has been more responsible than he was at the beginning of the season, which is nice to see that progress. And that's really the big thing here for Will Smith, is the fact that he has been learning, he has been accepting the criticisms and the teachings from the coaching staff, and he has been implementing that into his game very, very quickly. This is what's extremely important for a player in the NHL. They're not always going to come in with already very perfect games. Really, nobody is going to come in with that. It's about how quickly you're able to apply those teachings. That's what's going to allow you to stick in the NHL, and it's what Will Smith has definitely been doing. The major thing that kind of ties all of this around together, what has been maybe a big weakness for him thus far this season, is general lack of strength on the ice. This is to be expected, I would say. Again, for a 19-year-old, you're going up against very physically developed players. You're still a teenager in the NHL, so it's definitely tough to fit in and be able to win those puck battles. But once he is able to improve in that area, a lot of the other areas of his game are going to see that type of improvement as well. Now, this isn't the type of thing that's going to be able to get done in, like, say, during the season, during the 82-game year, more so a target for this upcoming off season, but it's going to help his shooting, it's going to help his skating, it's going to help his defensive and his offensive just zone coverage, and generally going to be that big thing that kind of improves him as a player for sure. And then one final thing that I do want to mention about Will Smith, it feels as though San Jose Sharks fans have been a little bit spoiled thus far this season because of Celebrini. Celebrini, the type of talent who's coming into the NHL at 18 years of age and is already passing every possible test with flying colors, which kind of makes, by comparison, Will Smith look a little bit worse. But Macklin Celebrini is a very, very special player, which I'll get to in a little bit later as to exactly why that is. When it comes to Will Smith, he's following a much more normal development path. Again, to bring up the draft year that he was taken in, 2023, sort of Connor Bedard is maybe in a bit of a class of his own, but the two other players taken above him, Adam Fantilli and Leo Carlsson, as I mentioned, both of them made their transitions to the NHL last season. They played their rookie years. They're now playing their sophomore seasons this year. Fantilli has 14 points this season. Leo Carlsson has 12 points this season. The level of production is very, very similar between these three guys. And Fantilli and Carlsson have been playing with superior line mates. Will Smith's most common even strength lineup this season is still Luke Cunnin and Barclay Goodrow. Both of them also have almost 3 minutes more of time on ice than Will Smith has had this season at just almost under 14 minutes. And so generally, he is given less of an opportunity to succeed. He's given less ice time to succeed as well, and yet he's still managing to keep up with two players who are also highly touted prospects. Those were two guys that outside of a Connor Bedard year could have potentially been first overall picks. That was the general theme around that draft as well, that they had such a strong top three. I would say Will Smith is doing a very good job at this point. Sure, those first few games definitely a struggle. Probably could have gone down to the AHL if the Sharks weren't so patient with him. But these days now, over these last month and a half, he has been so much better. This last game against Oilers I thought was quite good. The game against the Avalanche, also pretty good. The game against the Jets I thought was really good, even if he's not actually putting up these points. That's something that will come. It is about the fundamentals that you are establishing here, and Will Smith has them at this point. Then we move on to Macklin Celebrini, the big name player here for the San Jose Sharks, who has, of course, been leading the way, not just amongst Sharks rookies and Sharks prospects, but amongst Sharks player. He has already established himself as one of the most electric players on the team and likely the most skilled player as well. He was the first overall pick from this past year's draft, 2024. The Sharks end up winning the draft lottery, and there was really never any decision point to be made here. Mike Grier pretty much made it clear the moment the Sharks won the lottery that they would be picking Macklin Celebrini without coming outright and saying it, because he was the consensus choice. And when it comes to these first overall picks, a lot of the times the NHL will really try to hype them up, because the NHL draft is such an important day for a lot of teams. 16 teams, they make it to the playoffs, they have fun there, but the other 16 teams that miss out, the only thing that they really have to look forward to in the offseason is that draft. And so these first overall picks end up getting extremely hyped up to the highest level, and at times they actually end up getting a little bit overhyped. Look at Lafreniere, look at Shane Wright, look at Owen Power. These are guys who are solid players, but they were expected to be better than they currently are. Even look at Connor Bedard. After the Bedard mania over the full first season, he was touted as being the next Connor McDavid. And as good as Bedard is, and I really don't want to underestimate him as a player, I think Bedard is a fantastic, fantastic player who could easily be a top 10 center in the league as soon as next season, if we're being honest. But is he the next Connor McDavid? It seems like it's leaning towards not so much at this point. So indeed, even he was a little bit overhyped thus far. But when it comes to Celebrini, the general thought about him as a player was that he would be kind of like a Jonathan Toews-esque comparison, that he'd come in, he'd be a strong 200-foot player, and he'd be a good offensive output as well, but maybe not all that great. But I think Celebrini, who was actually undersold from his draft year, he has come here and been an extremely, extremely special talent. The fact that he is even in the conversations with that extremely hyped up Connor Bedard is a testament to how great he has been to start his career over these first full 24 games. Now, what does he do right? Well, there is absolutely so much. We'll start off with his shot, which is great. It's maybe not quite like Austin Matthews or Alex Ovechkin level yet. Again, he's 18 years old, which is something something that I'm going to be saying a lot for the rest of this video, but it has a good amount of strength to it. It's got great accuracy. It's extremely deceptive. He can change the angles. He can get it off very quickly and catch goaltenders by surprise. We've seen him beat some of the best goaltenders like Connor Hellebuck this season, and of course some of the worst like Philip Grubauer, but he's able to consistently beat NHL goaltenders with that ability to look off the shot and then still put it in the perfect position. It is incredibly admirable how he's able to do that. I could foresee Celebrini being a 40 to perhaps 50 plus goal scorer at some point in the future, and even sometime soon. But that is not all. His playmaking is also fantastic. His ability to find his teammates in really any possible area is really good. His movement in the ice, which actually opens up these passing lanes, has to also be appreciated, especially on the power play. You can see how he's able to kind of move up and down from the blue line along the boards. This allows him to get those passes through to players like Mikael Granlund on the complete other side of the ice. That is a very, very positive skill. There's one thing obviously to mention, which is something that I brought up as a kind of criticism for Celebrini in the past this season, is definitely his tendency to overforce on plays. This was more so happening in the earlier parts of the year, where there were many times, at least really once per game, he would kind of go for some crazy pass that just had like a 1% chance of actually working out. But honestly, like I mentioned with Will Smith, Celebrini has taken these criticisms in stride and has improved in those areas. Rarely do we actually see him make these moves over these last few games still, so he has improved there. When it comes to his skating, he is absolutely outstanding on his skates. It's not quite that same level of top speed as a Connor McDavid. He's not just going to make defensemen panic because of the amount of speed he's gathering in the neutral zone, but he's still an extremely smooth skater. Every single stride he takes is purposeful. There's not a little bit of wasted energy, and he still makes defensemen panic, not necessarily because he's coming in so fast, but because he is so maneuverable on his skates that defensemen, if you try to challenge him, you're going to immediately get burned. That goal against or I guess he didn't score, but the Luke Cunnin goal against the Carolina Hurricanes a couple of weeks ago, where he burns not just one but two Hurricanes players in the neutral zone who try to challenge him with the puck, and he easily just walks by them, was extremely impressive to see. And that's what happens if you go for a poke check, if you go even to get body position. Celebrini is going to be able to get right by you and have even more open ice to work with. That it's almost as though he's walking on his 2 feet instead of actually skating, but his skates are essentially just an extension of his body. It is fantastic to see him be able to do that, and his ability as well to activate off of the wall. We saw that the other day against the Colorado Avalanche, where he made Sam Girard look absolutely silly. That's something that is also a constant in his game. So his shooting, his assists, his skating, all really high up there as an extreme top level talent. But then his general hockey IQ and game sense is continuing to be praiseworthy as well. His ability to attack in areas, but not just be able to find that open ice, but to have the perfect timing to get to those areas as well. You hear when analysts talk about some of the best players in the game, they usually say something like, oh, the puck is following them around. That's not just by luck. That's not just, oh, it just so happens to bounce in his direction. That's a player who knows exactly where to be on the ice and exactly what moment that they need to be there so that the puck is coming in that direction. You can see Celebrini, he's able to drop coverage by skating up a little bit higher in the zone, making it seem as though he's out of the play, and then suddenly skate in at that exact moment where the pass is going to come towards him to get a great shot on net. We saw him do this really in every single game, but most recently just the other night or the other day against the Edmonton Oilers. He pulled that off in the third period a couple of times. So it leads to these great chances, and it shows how smart he is on the ice. But really, what kind of separates Celebrini from maybe previous young prospects coming into the NHL is not necessarily the offense, though him being great in every possible area is extremely commendable, but it is actually that 200-foot game that I mentioned a little bit earlier. I talked about when I was mentioning Will Smith that most of the time these young players, they come into the NHL and they're not super responsible defensively, and that is extremely understandable why that is. But Celebrini is changing the expectations there because he is quite solid defensively already. I've seen some sentiment of like, oh, he's a Selke candidate right out of the gate. I wouldn't go that far, but is he already one of the Sharks' better defensive forwards? Is he probably in the upper half of defensive forwards in the entire league? I would say so. And if you told me that he was a Selke candidate 2 to 3 years from now, I would definitely believe it, because he has the want to actually be a good defensive player. A lot of other forwards coming in, they're thinking offense, 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 and you really have to drill it into them that they need to have a 200-foot game. Celebrini, he wants to have the puck so much on his stick that he's not just working hard in the offensive zone, he's working hard in the defensive zone. He does need to make some improvements with general defensive positioning. When the puck is away from him and he's trying to cover his man, he can have a little bit of issues, get a little bit lost. But when the puck is near him and it involves him getting into a battle or using his stick to poke pucks away or separate his man from the puck, he is exceptional in that area. We've already talked about the fact that he is we actually haven't talked about it in this video, but we talked about it in the past, how he is one of the best players in the NHL this season when it comes to winning puck battles. As an 18-year-old, that is absolutely insane. His ability to go toe-to-toe with veteran players who you would think would be much stronger than him in these types of areas is extremely admirable. He is so good in this particular spot, and that allows him to be able to play more so with the puck, be more of an offensive player. It's one of the reasons why it directly relates to why he is also someone who has the most controlled zone entries heading in to the offensive zone, is because he's able to dig these pucks out for his team and then rush it up the ice with his fantastic skating. So everything is interconnected. He's not going to be as much of a great offensive player if it was not also for his fantastic defensive game. And then another thing that I do want to mention about Celebrini here, just as to continue to heap the praise on, is his face-off capabilities. Now, when it comes to many first overall picks coming into, or really any young center coming into the league, face-offs are a difficult thing to tackle and a difficult thing to get right out of the gate, because it is an entirely different skill from normal hockey games. You see players like Nico Sturm, for instance, of the Sharks, who's more of a fourth liner for them, probably isn't going to be anything more than that, and yet is over 60% in the faceoffs, because it's its own game. It's a game within a game. You need to know the tips and the tricks and the things that you can actually get away with, and so guys who have taken thousands of faceoffs have the advantage. When Celebrini lined up against Sidney Crosby this year against the Pittsburgh Penguins, he was going up against a guy who has taken almost 30,000 faceoffs throughout his career. So it's tough to adjust early on. I went back all the way for every single first overall center pick since Sidney Crosby in 2005. That is 10 different players. Crosby, Stamkos, Tavares, Nugent-Hopkins, McKinnon, McDavid, Matthews, Hischier, Hughes, and of course Connor Bedard just last year. Every single one of them had a below 50% face-off percentage in their rookie season. Most of them were in that mid to low 40s. A couple of them, actually the most recent ones, Bedard and Hughes, didn't even hit 40% in their rookie year. Celebrini right now is at a 49.6%. This is more or less 50%. He is winning every other faceoff as an 18-year-old just 24 games into his career. That is absolutely a mind-blowing statistic. I even took a look at someone like Patrice Bergeron, who during his prime in the NHL, he was known as one of the best faceoff guys in the entire league, who would always be dependable to be able to win a tough defensive zone draw for the Boston Bruins. Even he was sub 50% in his rookie season. So for Celebrini to come in at 18 years old and already be that good in that particular area, so amazingly impressive. It shows that he is not just willing to improve in the obvious areas like the offensive and the defensive zone, but even in that particular spot. You know, I mentioned Bedard and Hughes. Faceoffs aren't really as valued as they were 10 to 15 years ago. Now, because you can have more of your teammates come in and help you and things like that, the coaches don't really drill it in as much. It's why Bedard and Hughes are still struggling in those areas. It's why even some of the top players in the game like McDavid and McKinnon aren't all that great on the face-off dot. But for Celebrini to specifically target that and get very good in that area, extremely impressive for sure. And then one final thing here for Celebrini to continue on does have to do with the Sharks' captaincy. Now, currently, the Sharks' captain is Logan Couture, but as we know, he's only played 6 games last year, and he hasn't played a single game this year, and it's very likely that he will not. And it's possible at his age and with this injury that he may not play another NHL game, unfortunately, for the rest of his career. Now, there is, talk that he is still somewhat involved with the team and is still taking his role as captain seriously, but it is obviously quite clear that he can't be on the ice or be really heavily involved in this game-to-game basis. And so there is a possibility that with this offseason, depending on what ends up occurring, that Couture might end up losing that captaincy. I don't know if Greer would come outright and strip it from him, but I wouldn't be surprised if Couture himself, as a more honorable guy, would be willing to relinquish that title to give it to somebody else. And if you had asked me a year ago, I probably would have said Ferraro was in line. You could say whatever you want about him, of him being a good or a bad defenseman, likely more so leaning towards the bad, but he is definitely a heart and soul guy of this team, that the team has pretty much been preparing for him to become the next captain. He takes all of those ceremonial face-offs at the beginning of these games. He's essentially the de facto captain of the team right now while Couture is injured. But, as we have seen many times in the past with these rebuilding teams, when it comes to naming their new captain, a lot of the times they will default to their young star. The Oilers did it, the Sabres did it with Eichel, the Penguins with Crosby, the Devils with Hischier. You could go on and on with all of these young talent. And sometimes they're even done right as their sophomore season begins in the case of a McDavid or Crosby. And they might not even be built for that leadership role just yet. Obviously, I can't know a ton about what McDavid does behind the scenes, but he didn't always seem to have any sort of leadership qualities, especially in the earlier parts of the season. But a lot of times they are given the captaincy as a just lead by example type of situation. In this case, if a captaincy does open up, the major question would be, would Macklin Celebrini be a candidate for that? And while I can't pretend to know the behind the scenes situation with Celebrini, for all I know, he sits in the intermission and sits there silently for 15 minutes before heading back on the period for the ice. But when it comes to Celebrini, just based on the type of work ethic that he has shown on the ice, the willingness to get better every single day, the professionalism that he shows not only on the ice but also off the ice in post-game interviews like that, it seems as though he has all of the potential leadership qualities to not just lead by example by being the best player on the team, which is important in itself, but also to be that type of big voice in the locker room to help turn this team around. So Mario Ferraro is definitely like the easy choice, the one that the Sharks have been preparing for, but I wouldn't be that surprised if Celebrini ends up getting this choice, and especially if Couture ends up actually staying the captain until his contract rounds out in a couple of years. It would be at that point an extreme surprise if Celebrini didn't get the captaincy by then. So he seems to be in line to not just be a great player for the Sharks in the future, their best player on the team, but such a huge corner piece for the franchise moving into the future. But that will do it for this review of these two players. There was a lot to talk about here, but the future really is the point here, looking very, very bright with these two at the helm as that 1-2 center punch. Of course, considering if Smith does move back there, class dismissed.